Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the state's continued population loss and Governor J.B. Pritzker's response. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the home stretch of the Illinois General Assembly's spring session and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. The exodus from Illinois continues. Kevin Bessler has that story.
The latest census data for 2023 shows that people are moving out of Democratic strongholds like Illinois and into Texas, Florida, and Arizona. Ted Dabrowski, president of the nonprofit think tank WirePoints, says the data shows a majority of Illinois cities lost population.
93 out of the 122 cities shrunk in the past year. That's basically including all the big places, Cicero, Berwyn, Blue Island, Elmwood Park. I can just go down the list. They all shrunk, and that should be a big concern to everybody.
Dabrowski says if things don't change, Chicago is going to suffer the same fate as San Francisco.
San Francisco has lost 7% of its population since 2020. That's a big number, and if things get worse, it can create real problems. Chicago's only lost 3%, but that's in the wrong direction.
Dabrowski says the data shows that southern states are attracting people because they are more friendly with their government policies, job creation, and lower taxes. I'm Kevin Bessler.
And with the estimate released this week showing Illinois' largest cities continue to lose population, Governor J.B. Pritzker again denied it. Katrina Peterson reports.
When asked why he thinks the state's major cities are losing population, Pritzker said the state gained population and the annual estimates calculated by the U.S. Census Bureau are wrong.
And the post-enumeration survey determined actually Illinois got undercounted.
The 2020 post-enumeration survey Pritzker mentioned did lead to the census adding more people they missed. However, the census reported Illinois lost 79,500 people after approving the state's request to include 46,400 Illinoisans. That still leaves the 2020 population loss of 33,100 people. State Representative Chris Miller called Pritzker a population denier.
We've been bleeding population, we've been bleeding opportunity, and I'm really shocked that J.B. Pritzker is a population denier.
I'm Katrina Peterson.
Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, May 16th. We are in the closing days of Illinois' 2024 regular legislative session, with lawmakers scheduled to end business next Friday, May 24th, but the session could extend to May 31st if the legislature's business is not concluded on time. Despite time running out, we still have not seen a proposed budget from House Democrats, but there are plenty of groups with their hands out seeking more taxpayer dollars. Joining me today to discuss this is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois Associate Editor. Greg, we'll get back to the budget bill in a moment, but first let's talk about a group that was in Springfield this week seeking a huge increase in taxpayer funds. The Chicago Teachers Union descended on the state capitol Wednesday, bombarding lawmakers with requests for more. You were there, Greg. Tell us about it.
Yeah, hundreds of Chicago Teachers Union members getting a paid day off to come and lobby legislators here in Springfield. They left Chicago early in the morning with donuts, loaded up into buses, came down to Springfield and unloaded. And then they hit the ground running, going and seeing their legislators and putting pressure on them to give Chicago Public Schools more money. And as you mentioned, we have yet to see a budget bill. And all of this comes as the governor has asked state agencies to be mindful of the possibility of $800 million less in revenue than they initially anticipated, because the governor's proposed $1 billion in tax increases on businesses is not popular. So you can imagine with a crunch in the budget expected, the prospects of $1 billion+ for Chicago Public Schools, that makes things a bit tricky. So the red shirts were on the campus here in Springfield, hitting up their legislators. But before they arrived, Senate Republicans, they took to a news conference and said that Chicago Public Schools are failing. They are not showing that they are deserving of more money. They already get a lot more money through block grants from state taxpayers, in addition to the extra money they receive as part of the evidence-based funding model. And State Senator Don DeWitt said that it's unfortunate that Democrats and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson have the Chicago Teachers Union to come down to Springfield to, quote, bully lawmakers into giving them more state taxpayer funds. So with all of the demands that there are on top of the state budget already, just for regular course of activities, keeping state government operating, paying salaries for everything from state police to people who help process your driver's license, all of these things obviously are priorities, but this is the time of the year every year at the State House where groups like the Chicago Teachers Union and others hit the hallways of the state capitol asking for more taxpayer dollars.
Greg, the Chicago Teachers Union is far and away the largest teacher union in the state of Illinois. They're not afraid to use their union dues on political causes. They're large supporters of largely Democratic candidates for office. The fact that the state legislature, both chambers of the state legislature, the House and the Senate, have supermajorities of Democrats controlling it. How much influence do you think they have over lawmakers, particularly during this budget time, and also after J.B. Pritzker, his staff sent memos to department heads across the state, hey, we're going to have to make some cuts to my initial budget proposal?
Yeah, I think some Democrats do recognize the budget crunch that's ahead. If they can't, bite the bullet, so to speak, and approve tax increases to the tune of $1 billion, then, where are they going to be able to find any more resources to give to Chicago Public Schools? And I think there is a recognition amongst the rank and file Democrats that that's a tall order, and it's going to be difficult to make good on any of those requests, let alone some of the things the governor's laid out that he wants to increase spending on. Everything from early childhood initiatives that the governor wants to spend more on. He also has a grocery initiative, a couple of $1 million here and there. He wants to, set aside millions of dollars to alleviate medical debt. He's got, of course, the increased funding for K through 12 schools that's set in law, $350 million extra dollars every year. So clearly, again, demands are high, revenues not coming in as they anticipated, at least when it comes to the proposed tax increases for the next fiscal year. So I think some Democrats recognize that all of these things, it's going to be tough for them to keep any kinds of promises. But then you also get things like the Chicago Bears, and whether or not they're going to be able to tackle that particular issue. So will Chicago Teachers Union see their lobbying efforts bear any fruit? Will Chicago Public Schools get the extra hundreds of millions of dollars they're seeking? These things we really won't know until probably the final hours of legislative session.
Greg, before we get into more on the budget and other legislative activity, just a bit of a brief sidebar. I find it too interesting not to bring it up. Chalkboard News, a sister news site of the Center Square, also published by Franklin News Foundation. Anyway, Chalkboard News broke a story this week that the Chicago School District, Chicago Public Schools, spent more than $600,000 over the past few years on balloons. Your partner, Katrina Peterson, asked the Chicago Teachers Union about that while they were in Springfield this week. Briefly tell me about that.
They dismissed the question. They dismissed the question and said they're not there to talk about balloons. They're talking about more money for CPS. But Katrina also asked another question that I think is on a lot of taxpayers' minds, especially outside of Chicago, when you've got Chicago Teachers Union and the public schools asking for more downstate tax dollars to go to Chicago. How do you balance and make the proficiencies of Chicago students? How do you increase that? How do you make sure that they're going to be able to read well, that they're able to do math at grade level? So their response to that was, why don't you ask Chicago Public Schools? So they deferred a lot of questions to Chicago Public Schools while demanding that Chicago Public Schools get more money. So kind of interesting to see some tough questions being asked to the teachers union as a group and them seeming to just dismiss those questions.
Thank you, Greg. Getting back to the budget now, while we're still waiting to see a House budget be introduced into the session, all we really have to look at right now is Governor Pritzker's proposed budget, which he pitched back in February when he gave his State of the State address. We know he's asking for a record amount of spending by state government, but to pay for his proposal, he needed about, as you said, $1 billion in tax increases. A number of those tax increases, we understand, even Democrats are pushing back on those proposals. As session winds down, is there enough time for lawmakers to consider these tax increases? Why don't you just briefly talk about those proposed tax increases and what they mean?
Yeah, so the governor's proposed budget was $52.7 billion. Keep in mind, Dan, when I first started here 10 years ago, it was, $32, $33, $35 billion. Wow. Now we're seeing $52 billion. So the amount of taxpayer spending on the state budget continues to increase at what some would say is an alarming level. And Republicans have said that much. And even back in February, Republicans were like, we can't afford this budget. We can't afford the $1 billion of tax increases the governor's looking for. Those tax increases ranged from one in particular would change the business loss deduction that businesses can claim to have a lesser tax burden. And these of course get really complicated and things that businesses have tax attorneys that they consult with and that they contract with to work on these things. But regardless, the proposal the governor was making would have brought in or increased taxes by around $500 million. So that was a big nugget of the governor's proposed tax changes. Obviously, the business community staunchly opposed to that. Another one was a cap on the discount in taxes that the state's retailers get, because the state's retailers, when you go to the store and you buy goods, you pay a sales tax. There's not a government agent there demanding that you give the government their sales tax. No, it's the retailer that's there charging you that sales tax, and they have to remit that back to state and local governments. Well, they get a discount in Illinois to do that, and that retailer's discount has been around for decades. There's also been decades of talk of trying to cap it to bring in more revenue for the state. The governor's proposal would have brought in about $200 million of tax increases that retailers would have been on the hook for. But retailers pushed back, and even though there's been this ongoing idea of these tax increases not being popular, they did discuss the retailers' tax discount in a committee hearing earlier this week. And the sponsor of the measure, State Representative Will Guzzardi, even admitted that some of the smaller retailers in his district say that the retailer's discount doesn't even cover the cost of the retailers using their time, their manpower, their infrastructure to be the government's tax collector. And the Illinois Retail Merchants Association was somewhat astounded that somebody admitted that. A legislator actually admitted that the discount doesn't help cover the cost of these retailers acting as the tax collector. But then, Guzzardi also said, hey, other states have more strict caps on retailers' discounts. And, look at, say, Tennessee, or he pointed to some other states. But Carr, he fired back and said no other state in the country can compare to Illinois, because Illinois has the most taxing bodies in the country that overlap and have different rates, and the retailers are the ones that have to police all of that, and they have to remit the taxes on a more regular basis, all while being under the threat of audit. So that's another of the tax proposals the governor has out there that is getting a lot of pushback. Another one is the doubling of the tax percentage on sports betting companies. And that would have raised a couple of $100 million as well. But sports betting companies pushing back on that pretty vociferously. And essentially, when you see these types of conversations, the businesses are being taxed. Well, when you get down to it, you have a lot of people saying, while a business may be the ones paying the tax, they're pushing that cost down to the consumer. And I imagine the same could happen with sports betting. So those are just a few of the tax increase proposals the governor had that still unclear whether or not that's actually going to get across the finish line, if at all be brought up during the budget.
We talked last week about the story you broke at the centersquare.com about this memo that the Pritzker administration sent out to department heads saying, hey, our budget was reliant on these tax increases that you just talked about and explained. There's a whole lot of pushback on these things, so you need to be prepared to cut your budget proposals. Pritzker was asked about that at an unrelated event this week about that memo, and he responded to the question. Just tell us briefly about that.
Yeah, and he said, listen, the legislature is the one that's actually in control of the budgets, the power of the purse that you hear about, and the governor's budget is merely a proposal at this point. And he said that the legislatures, at least in the governor's tenure so far, now in his second term, he says they've about 95% agreed with his budgets in the past. But the governor touts that he's gotten multiple credit rating increases because he has enacted balanced budgets. And he said that the message the memo sends is that he will not be signing an unbalanced budget. And that's why he put that memo out telling state agencies to prepare for the possibility of $800 million less in revenue than anticipated in his proposed budget, because he will not sign an unbalanced budget. But we'll also see whether or not there's going to be any tricks, any gimmicks, any borrowing from funds here or there, sweeping of dollars from special funds, or, borrowing money to pay for immediate expenses. However, the governor said that he does not want to do those types of things. So we'll be here on the ground, and taxpayers can follow along at thecentersquare.com for some of that last-minute reporting, which unfortunately, Dan, could happen at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I hope you're ready for that.
That's a typical year, Greg. We should all be ready for that. It's not like we haven't gone through this, sadly, before. Let's briefly talk about pensions, Greg. You referenced the credit rating agencies and Governor Pritzker touting the upgrades that the state has seen in recent years. Well, there's concerns now about legislator discussions about enhancing Tier 2 pensions. This was the pension system that was put in place several years ago. We have a pension debt crisis in Illinois. Illinois' 5 state-funded pension systems are about $140 billion underfunded. Several years ago, the state legislature created a Tier 2 with decreased benefits for new hires based on when they were hired after this went into place. But now legislators are saying they might need to enhance those Tier 2 benefits. That would only balloon the unfunded burden?
Yeah, so 2011, new hires after that date are not getting in the Tier 1 pensions. Tier 1 pensions, very generous. Those who retire with Tier 1 benefits get 3% compounded annual increases in their pension benefits. So that adds up rather quick. And I know that inflation the past few years has been rather high, but, 9-10% inflation is nowhere near where, it was like maybe 1 or 2% a year. So 3% compounded annual increases is a lot. But after 2011, Tier 2 was created, and it's fewer benefits. It's lesser benefits. And the idea was that Tier 2 could help offset some of the exorbitant costs of Tier 1. But you have some legislators and union members that are saying that it's hard to attract and retain public employees with the Tier 2 pension benefits. And there's also concerns about provision in retirement law about safe harbor. And we can get into that if we have time. However, I'm looking at the clock and people may want to, talk to their tax professional about that idea. But regardless, the bottom line is there's an effort underway here at the State House to enhance Tier 2 pension benefits, which could add to the overall unfunded pension liability. Fitch Ratings Agency just put out a report, real short. It just said, listen, if they're only looking to touch on the adequacy of, say, the safe harbor, then there might not be much impact to the state's credit rating. However, if they were to do anything of the sort to try to bring Tier 2 up to the level of Tier 1, that could bring about some bad consequence for the state's unfunded pension liability and could also affect the state's credit rating. Dan, Illinois has among the worst credit rating in the country, if not the worst credit rating in the country, despite having several credit rating upgrades and the state recently being moved from a neutral outlook to a positive outlook by Moody's. You got to think whether or not the governor would be, who touts all of these credit rating upgrades he's received under his tenure. You got to wonder if he'd be favorable of increasing Tier 2 pension benefits, if it's going to mean the possibility of negative impacts on the state's credit rating. So clearly there's a lot that legislators are going to have to contend with, and whether or not we see Tier 2 benefits being enhanced, I don't know if that's going to come this year, but it's still an ongoing conversation that legislators have had for months upon months.
Right, Greg, there's a couple of other stories I was hoping to get to, but as you said, we are running out of time. So first, let me just briefly explain the safe harbor rule that you mentioned earlier. Essentially, there's an IRS safe harbor standard that requires pension systems to be an adequate replacement for Social Security benefits. Many Illinois state workers do not qualify for Social Security benefits because they don't pay into Social Security because of the pension system. So if the Tier 2 pension somehow falls short in the IRS's mind of Social Security standards, then the lawmakers say, and then maybe we also would have to enhance the Tier 2 pensions. Greg, we just have a few seconds left. You've been covering the legislature since January of this year, this current session since January. We're down to perhaps the last week and a half. You expect some long nights and maybe even weekends?
Well, right now, as we talk, the House and Senate are both in session, and they are churning bills out. The House is passing Senate bills to the governor. The Senate's passing House bills to the governor. I think just this past week, they've passed 77 bills altogether. I think since I've been on the phone with you, they've probably passed a couple of dozen bills just in the 20 minutes we've been talking. So think about this, Dan. Last year, they passed 665 bills. 665 bills.
Wow.
Could they be on pace to do that this year? I guess time will tell. There could be some things left on the cutting room floor, but I fully anticipate we'll see another hundreds upon hundreds of bills passed that taxpayers are going to have to sift through to find out how it's going to impact their bottom line. And we'll do our darndest to keep people updated on all that impacts them at thecentersquare.com.
Greg, thank you for joining us again today. Good luck during the home stretch of the final hours of the Illinois legislative session. As Greg just noted, you can keep up with Greg and team's coverage at thecentersquare.com.